Hi everyone, welcome back. We're starting Chapter 9, and in a lot of ways, Chapter 9 is really the capstone to our semester. We've been learning about supply and demand, we've been putting them together in a market, and Chapter 9 really takes all the concepts we've dealt with so far and puts them together. So a quick aside, that doesn't mean that Chapter 10, our next chapter, Monopoly, isn't important, but really that serves as sort of an epilogue. It takes this very strong concept we're learning in competition right now, and it adds some frictions to it. But right now we're on Chapter 9, Firms in a Competitive Marketplace. And just to refresh everyone's memory, what we were talking about last chapter was how economists look at the different sorts of costs of a business and put them together to consider economic profit. And remember, we mean economic profit, which is taking opportunity costs into account. We don't mean accounting profit. And this is very profound. So I remember when I first learned about competition in the marketplace, when I was sitting in the seats you're sitting in now, I found this very sort of depressing, but it's actually very powerful. If you were thinking about forming a business one day, not to think about it in terms of this accounting profit, but really in terms of economic profit and what your opportunity cost of running that business is. The other really important concept to keep in mind here is that we're dealing with economic modeling, which means we're abstracting from reality. And really, the important thing is to think about the implications for if the market were to exist this way. When we say firms in a competitive market, we mean firms as if they were in a competitive market, and we'll see what that means in a little bit. So last chapter we were talking about how marginal cost, which runs opposite to marginal product, marginal cost is the most important part of a firm's cost structure, and that's because averages follow margins. Again, think about your grade in this class versus your GPA overall. When you all do quite well in this class, it's going to pull your GPA up. Averages follow the margins, which makes marginal cost the most important part of a firm's cost structure. And to see why this marginal cost curve is so important, it can be helpful to revisit that graph. So remember, we have two different kinds of costs. We have fixed costs and variable costs. Together, fixed and variable make total costs. So fixed costs don't change with our output. And that means that on average, they approach zero. Suppose our fixed cost is $11. That's true when we have no output. That's true when we have 100 units of output. So that $11, as you divide it by a greater and greater number, approaches zero. Marginal cost, in other words, only relates to this concept of variable cost. Now, marginal cost is just the inverse of marginal product. And remember, at some point, our marginal product begins to decrease. We have diminishing marginal product, which means at some point, our marginal costs begin to increase. Now, averages follow the margin, which means our average variable cost curve is going to be U-shaped. When average variable cost is greater than marginal cost, it's decreasing. In other words, when the margin is less than the average variable cost is going down. When the marginal cost starts increasing due to diminishing marginal product, average variable cost eventually starts increasing as well. The marginal cost curve here is pulling that average variable cost up. And average total cost is just the sum of average variable cost and average fixed cost. But keep in mind that average fixed cost approaches zero as our quantity, our output, gets infinite, which means average total cost approaches average variable cost. It's going to have a very similar shape, that U shape. But over here where average fixed costs are high, average variable cost and average total costs are going to be quite far apart. And over here Where average fixed cost is low, the cost curves get closer and closer together. And all this is just recap of what we were doing last chapter, which brings us to the big questions from this chapter. Remember, we're talking about firms in a perfectly competitive market. So our big questions are, how do competitive markets work? How do firms maximize profits? And what the supply curve of these firms look like in a perfectly competitive market. And remember, we're going to see that perfectly competitive markets are quite rare in the naturally occurring world, but serve as an incredibly useful model for how we can think about supply and demand working together moving forward. With that, let's bring this little lecture nugget to a close, and we'll regroup on the next video.